Anytime you try to take a picture with your smartphone or your digital camera, your camera actually does some things. It tries to calculate the amount of light that is required or that is needed to correctly capture the image, and as a result controls the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO on either your smartphone or your digital camera. Today I'm going to be explaining the principles of exposure triangle and the usefulness. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Michael Hadileye. This channel is for photographers and cinematographers who want to improve their skill sets. So if you're just joining us for the first time, I welcome you, and I will advise that you kindly subscribe because we'll be having lots of content that's going to be educative and creative for you. So today we'll be discussing the exposure triangle. What is exposure triangle? Exposure triangle consists of three angles that are very important in photography. We have the shutter speed, we have the aperture, and the ISO, not in any order of ranking. The shutter speed is measured in fraction of a second, and it calculates the amount of time the curtain in front of your camera sensor is exposed to light in order to capture image. Shutter speed can also be classified into two. We have the fast shutter speed and the slow shutter speed. The fast shutter speed is used to freeze moving subjects. The slow shutter speed, on the other hand, is actually used to create motion blur effects, or when you want to do light painting photography or long exposure photography. So when you increase the shutter speed, it means that you are actually telling your camera to speed up the duration of time that the curtain in front of your camera is open in order for the sensor to be exposed to light. On the other hand, when you reduce shutter speed, what you're telling your camera is to slowly open the curtain in front of the camera sensor in order for more light to fall on your camera sensor to capture a brighter image. So a fast shutter speed would mean that you are having lesser light falling on the sensor, while a slow shutter speed means that you're having plenty of light falling on your camera sensor, which means that the image will become brighter compared to when you have a faster shutter speed. The second thing we're going to talk about is the aperture. Aperture deals with your lenses, while the shutter speed deals with your camera. When you're setting your shutter speed, you are actually controlling your camera settings in exposure to light. And when you're controlling your aperture, you're actually controlling the ring in your lenses, which means that aperture actually controls the amount of light that you allow to pass through the lens in order to fall on your camera sensor. Aperture, on the other hand, controls how open or closed the hole in your lens is, which also controls the amount of light that is allowed to fall on your camera sensor. Aperture can be classified into two. We have the wide or large aperture and the small or narrow aperture. When you open your aperture, you allow more light to fall on your camera sensor, and when you close down your aperture, you reduce the amount of light that falls on your camera sensor. Aperture and shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field is achieved when you open up your aperture to its widest. As a result of this, you have some part of your scene in focus while the other part is out of focus. Small aperture is good when you want the larger part or all the elements in frame to be in focus. This is excellent for capturing establishment shots, landscape, or a scene with more than one person, as this will help you to put all subjects in focus. And the third part of the exposure triangle is the ISO. Now that we know that the shutter speed controls the camera while the aperture controls the lens, the ISO is actually what determines the sensitivity of your camera to light. How sensitive means that with the available light, how good can your camera see and how clear can your pictures be. The sensitivity of a Nikon D800 to light is different from the sensitivity of Sony A6400, Sony A7S III to light. That's when you talk about the low light camera, to mention just few. The higher your ISO, the brighter your picture, but you have to be careful that sometimes when you increase your ISO above the base ISO, you may likely have a grainy experience. So now that you understand the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, then let's talk about the exposure compensation. So how do I compensate my shutter speed for my aperture? How do I compensate my aperture for ISO? The first thing you want to do is to set your ISO. Keep your ISO at 100. Then the next thing you can do is actually to set your shutter speed. For instance, if you're shooting an interview, you want to keep your shutter speed at 1/50 or 1/60. Because your frame rate can be like 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. And what you're supposed to do is to double your frame rate, which is if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you can keep it at 50 or 48 if your camera actually allows, or you keep it at 60. So after doing that, the next thing you want to do is to set your aperture. Now, depending on the scene, let's assume you have just one subject in front of your scene, and you're not really after ensuring that every part of the subject is in focus. For an interview, for instance, the most important part of the interview is the person's face. So you want to make sure the person's face is in focus. So when you set your aperture to say f2.8, it's going to capture that. But for you to be on the same part, you can keep it at f4. Okay, so in that kind of case, let's assume you have less of light. Okay, the light you are exposed to is not sufficient and your image is a bit darker. So how do you compensate in that situation? So the first thing you want to do is to consider increasing your ISO. Okay, so for me, I'm going to increase my ISO from 100 to say 400 or 500 and see how it looks. If the image looks a bit darker still, then I'm going to turn down my aperture to say f1.8. From f4, I can move to f2.8. Then if I still have some darkness, then I'm going to either look for additional light or still reduce my aperture to f1.8. With this, I should be able to get a well-exposed image. On the other hand, if you're exposed to excess light, the first thing you want to do is to check out your ISO. If your ISO is at 500, then bring it down to 100. Then look at your aperture. You can increase your aperture to say f5.6. Now, if you're still exposed to lots of light and you can't control the light, let's say it's a daylight, then what you can do is to get an ND filter in order to reduce the amount of light that is falling on your camera. So the most important thing for you as a photographer or a cinematographer is to make sure that your scene is correctly exposed using the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, coupled with the available light and getting the well-exposed image. And what is a well-exposed image? A well-exposed image is said to be achieved when the cinematographer or the photographer achieve what he or she intended. That means what you have in mind. And we say an image is said to be underexposed when the shadow details is lost. So when there is loss in shadow details, we say an image is said to be underexposed. And an image is said to be overexposed when the highlight details is also lost. So these are the basic things that you need to know as a photographer in order to capture a well-exposed image, because at the end of the day, it's just a matter of how well or how balanced your image or your scene or your footage or rushes become. So I hope you learned one or two things today. And if you like this video, kindly subscribe, and thank you. See you some other time. Bye for now.